I'm Neil Atkinson. This is for Hope Not Hate, and we are in Home Baked in North Liverpool with Gordon Brown to chat about food poverty, to chat about Brexit, to chat about all of this. And we'll start with a food poverty statistic. North Liverpool food bank usage, according to the Trussell Trust, has increased 40% in the last business year, Gordon. Before we even talk about the impact a no-deal Brexit will have on that, a 40% increase is hugely significant and damaging to communities.
The rise in the use of food banks is true right across the country. In my own area, Fife in Scotland, it's gone up by more than 50%. And I think that's going to be true of the whole country. So you've got more people in poverty, more children in poverty, more using food banks. The price of food already going up, putting more people under pressure, people who are giving to food banks who often have very little, having to give but themselves under financial pressure. And now you've got the threat of a no-deal Brexit. And if that happens, then food prices will definitely go up again, perhaps by 10%, according to the Cabinet Secretary. And that means the most vulnerable, the people who are most in need, the people who are under greatest pressure will be hit most. And the government is doing nothing about it. So we have got to stop a no-deal Brexit, because a no-deal Brexit will interrupt the supply of food and push food prices up.
When we talk about food banks, people who work there, who volunteer there, they're good people giving their time, or people who give to food banks are good people giving their food away for those who are poorest and most in need. But there's a wider conversation, isn't it, which is the very need for food banks should be against the values of our society, full stop.
Yeah, in the last few years, food banks have mushroomed around the country. And you've not just got food banks now, you've got clothes banks, you've got toiletry banks, you've got bedding banks, you've got baby banks, all because millions, in fact billions, have been taken out of the money that should be being paid to people with decent wages, to people to back up the wages because they've got children, to the child tax credit system, and to introduce universal credit and to take billions away from the system is to penalise the people who are already poor and make them even poorer. And as we see the impact of a no-deal Brexit, then poverty will get worse. But the government doesn't seem to care that there are now 3 million children rising to 4 million children, rising to 5 million children in poverty. And we've got to alert people to the fact that, one, universal credit is not working, and it will never work the way it's been organised. Two, all these changes in the benefit system, like the two-child payment, so you don't get help if you've got 3 children, all these onerous conditions of benefit have got to be removed. And 3, we cannot afford a no-deal Brexit for the poorest families of this country. It may be okay for Jacob Rees-Mogg and okay for Boris Johnson, who drinks £180 bottles of wine, he says, but for people who are struggling on only a few pounds, no-deal Brexit could push them over the edge.
The generosity within communities that you get to see around food banks, around food bank usage, speaks to the fact that there is still significant amounts and potential for social cohesion in this country. But the flip side of that is the very need for them speaks to the fact that social cohesion has been under massive, massive pressure since 2010, perhaps even before, in terms of the economic conditions. People are under massive, massive amounts of pressure, and that's only going to get worse, social cohesion, after a no-deal Brexit.
I think the most important thing that you're saying is that there are millions of people who are helping other people in this country, but they themselves are under pressure. I mean, I often find it's the people who have least who do the most to help people in difficulty. So if you go into a supermarket where they're collecting for a food bank, you'll find it's the elderly pensioner who's putting in a tin of soup or putting in a bit of pasta or something for people who are poor, but she also is poor. And I think we've got to recognise that the people who are helping food banks are being stretched to the limit as well. But what happens with a no-deal Brexit is that people are made poorer, communities are put under real pressure, jobs will start to go, a manufacturing recession is almost inevitable, so the manufacturing industries like the car industry and so on, which export so much to Europe, start to be hit. And therefore you see communities that try to do their best to help each other, unable even to do that. And when you're taking millions out of a community by cutting social security benefit and then expecting people to make up the difference, it just becomes after a time impossible. And that's why we've got to worry about the effect on communities, not just of the social security cuts, but of the no-deal Brexit.
With that no-deal Brexit and without those communities being under the strain that they're under, there is a clear, I'd say, issue around the fact that we have here a Tory party problem in the first place, which is the European Union. then be connected to a Tory party solution, which is the no-deal Brexit. And the backdrop of this is another huge problem created by those policies that have been enacted since 2010, that all of this is just mining and chipping away at those communities you refer to.
Well, I think what you've got to remember is we didn't need to have a referendum on the European Union. That was to solve an internal Conservative Party problem. And when the referendum gave its result, the Conservative government could have said, look, let's look at all the problems that have caused this Brexit rebellion, but didn't do that. And then we have now Boris Johnson, who's insisting on a no deal, even although no deal was never mentioned as the likely outcome when it was the referendum in 2016. I mean, even in 2017, the government's manifesto, the Conservative Party's manifesto, promised a smooth and orderly exit. Now, nothing can be less smooth and less orderly than what we're seeing at the moment, and all to solve an internal Conservative Party problem where they have Brexiteers and people who want to leave under all terms and conditions that are onerous because they hate Europe so much. Now, I think most people who voted Brexit are now worried about a no-deal Brexit, and they're worried about the consequences for their lives, for their livelihoods, for their communities, and for the country as a whole. And I haven't seen the country ever so divided as it is now, and I haven't seen people so worried that there is no way forward under the present set of policies that are leading us to this no-deal cliff edge. It's like crashing out, and something that obviously affects people's lives directly. So we're in this problem because of mistakes that have been made by the political system. But to get out of this problem, we need the public to say, look, whatever way I voted in this Brexit referendum, a no deal is a disaster for this country. A no deal is not only a no deal Brexit, but as someone was telling me a few minutes ago, it's also for many people a no meal Brexit. They run out of food. They can't afford the food that they need. They'll feed their children before they feed themselves, and in the end, people are suffering very badly as a result.
It feels, I think, for some people as though it's an exaggerated conversation all the time, this, but there is genuine threat of the idea of thousands, tens of thousands of lorries unable to get into the country, that things will be absolutely backed up. And because it's been so long since we've seen anything like it, it does almost feel a little sci-fi, a little dystopian, but that is genuinely what's at stake here.
Well, look at the effects of a no-deal Brexit. If lorries cannot get into the country, then look at the effect on medical supplies, because 1 million medical consignments come in every day to Britain. That's 37 million a month, 400 million a year, separate medical items that are essential to save people's lives and to protect people's health. You take the example of EpiPens. Last year, EpiPens were in short supply because of a fire in the factory that produced them in Germany. And they had to reduce the number of EpiPens that were given on prescription, and they had to extend the use-by dates, and they had to bring some injectors back into use that were previously about to be ditched. Now, just think what would happen if, because 2/3 of medical supplies come through Calais and then through Dover, you don't get these medical supplies of EpiPens into the country, and just how many people who have allergies would be affected through not having the EpiPen, which is mainly produced outside Britain. And then take flu vaccines. Now, we'll be producing millions of doses of flu vaccines every year, but again, most of them come from Europe. And because there's been a very severe Australian strain of flu, they've had to reconfigure the flu vaccine for this year to protect people properly against flu. And now we find that because of the reconfiguration, there's 1 million doses of flu vaccine that cannot be ready to come to Britain from Europe by October the 31st, and we don't know when they'll arrive after October the 31st. So once again, disabled people who rely on the flu vaccine are put at risk, waiting for it, and it may not come as the winter gets on. So yet another example of where a medical supply is dependent on trade with Europe, is cut off, and people are put at risk. And you can go through isotopes for cancer treatment. You can look at many other ways that the vaccines, the medical treatments, the drugs are simply not available. Insulin's another one. So there are 1 million diabetics in this country who depend on insulin. Insulin mainly comes from outside Britain. Most of the supplies of insulin come from 3 major companies. But if that supply of insulin is halted, then you can't stockpile in the way that you can with other things, because the insulin runs out of its effectiveness. And if you bring them in by air, it is so expensive that the government has already rejected that, except in very special cases. So there are 1 million diabetics who rely on insulin coming into the country. Now, any government that was given advice about the effect of the reduction of medical supplies or even the risk to medical supplies would not go ahead with a no-deal Brexit. But lives and livelihoods are put at risk. And I say to MPs, you've got to think, yes, you've got to take into account what people voted in the referendum, and we've got to listen to the grievances that have got to be addressed. But in all conscience, can you vote for a no-deal Brexit when you're aware that some of your constituents may suffer from the reduction of supplies of medical treatments and drugs?
The strange thing about the no-deal Brexit for me is that at some point there will have to be a deal with the European Union. That we literally have this trading bloc just right across there, and at some sort of point, there will, whether we're in the European Union or not, well, if we're not in the European Union, we have to at some point come to a deal, come to an arrangement with them anyway about how we're going to trade, how we're going to interact.
Well, a no-deal Brexit does not mean that there'll never be a deal. It will just be a worse deal later. Because at some point there'll have to be a negotiation, because we still want to trade with Europe. I mean, even the most ardent Brexiteers know that you've got to have goods coming in and out, that people want to holiday in mainland Europe, that people want to study there, that pensioners want to retire there. So you've got to have a deal at some point. The question is what kind of deal and how much is going to be lost in the meantime. If you take the car industry, most of the cars we produce in Britain are exported to mainland Europe. So we produce about 1.5 million cars a year. Only just over 200,000 of them are sold in Britain, about 280,000. So 80% of the cars we produce here are exported. Most of them go to some country in the European Union. If we are not selling to the European Union, or if because of a no deal, the price of these cars goes up because tariffs are imposed by the European Union, and people don't buy these cars, then we lose jobs, we lose factories. We already have the closure of the Honda plant in Swindon on the way, of the Bridgend plant for Ford in Wales. We already have people talking about short time. Toyota in Derby are saying that they're going to close the factory on November the 1st because they don't know that they can guarantee the supplies coming into the country. And so just look at the effect of a no deal, even when you know that at some point you've got to have a deal, but it will be a worse deal.
I want to talk about, you were part of the government in 1997, obviously Chancellor of the Exchequer, and you were obviously privy to everything that was going on in Northern Ireland. To me, it now seems as though it was hugely under-discussed prior to the referendum. And I think for a lot of people may be watching this, the brilliance of the statecraft, the number of different parties who came together and were signatories and part of the Good Friday Agreement, the very fact that there was a referendum after that has been lost historically. It's arguably not taught well enough Irish history in British schools. We find ourselves in a position where we're prepared to risk all of that as well.
If you want to have no border separating South and North Ireland, between the Republic and the Northern Ireland area, which is called Ulster, you have to have an agreement with the European Union, because the border between Europe, the European Union of the 27, and Britain, which is leaving the European Union, will be between North and South. And so you've got to do something to ensure that trade flows. But you've got to recognise that, let's say the American government had a trade deal with Britain and all these chlorinated chickens were coming into the country, which is what people fear that the Americans will insist on in the deal. Well, the European Union is against chlorinated chickens, and even if they were coming into the United Kingdom, they would have to prevent them coming into the European Union. So you need to have some way of regulating what happens on your border. And so the government has not considered this seriously enough. It is a real problem. And that's why Northern Ireland voted to stay in the European Union. Sometimes it's misunderstood because the DUP, the party that is the main party in Northern Ireland, is against the European Union, that the people of Northern Ireland voted to leave the European Union. They voted to stay in the European Union, and they want no hard border between the South and North. And it's very important that we do something to make that happen.
In general, a lot of what you're referring to there becomes, this is a conversation about Englishness. for me, it feels as though there's this threat of a lot of this is an expression of English nationalism, and that in general nationalism is on the rise. We can see evidence of it elsewhere around the globe, and nationalism is something to be, you know, it creates circumstances where extreme right-wing movements can get some traction, and this is where we are.
Well, we've got four nationalisms in Britain today. We've got Scottish nationalism that wants independence for Scotland. We've got Plaid Cymru in Wales that wants independence for Wales. We've got Ulster nationalism that we've just talked about, and we've now got Boris Johnson's anti-European nationalism. So it's Britain, but mainly England, against Europe, and that's how he sees the equation. And all these movements are trying to whip up popular support for what is essentially a negative proposition, because what nationalism does is it destroys empathy between peoples. It kills off reciprocity between different countries. It destroys cooperation that is a necessary element of an interdependent world. And the solidarity between peoples that we often talk about, that Scots, English, Welsh and Irish people have a huge amount in common, is actually undermined by nationalist rhetoric that says it's us versus them, Scots versus English, Welsh versus English, English versus Scots, and so on. And nationalism has become a poisonous doctrine right across Europe. And it's because people have forgotten the effects of nationalism in the 1930s and how it divided Europe that they can even contemplate a return to that kind of nationalism again. And we have got to point out that if you want cooperation, if you want solidarity, if you want empathy between peoples and not enmity between peoples, and if you want reciprocity, then you have got to fight this nationalist ideology, which is a dogma that tries to set one group of people against another group of people. And that's why Hope Not Hate, in saying that any form of racial or ethnic prejudice is totally unacceptable, religious prejudice is totally unacceptable in the modern world. And really what I'm afraid Brexit is bringing out is a kind of Britain that is isolationist and xenophobic and hateful of foreigners, when actually the best of Britain is that we're tolerant and we're outward-looking and internationalist and fair-minded and pragmatic and not dogmatic about our relations with people in the rest of the world.
Do you feel as though because of this expression, because of the expression of nationalism in this time, our institutions are under threat? I mean, this is what people I'm speaking to at the moment, and we've all got to be careful. We all exist in our bubbles, but almost every conversation I have about anyone politically at the minute, people are concerned, they are scared, and they are worried about the institutions that are meant to protect them.
Well, it's Boris Johnson who's threatening our democratic institutions. I mean, he is cancelling Parliament and proroguing it so it doesn't meet. So we have not only a no-deal Brexit in line, a no-debate, a no-democracy Brexit. It's Boris Johnson that is now telling his Conservative MPs that they're going to be thrown out of his party if they don't vote this way, and they cannot use their conscience when they see the effects of a no-deal. And of course, it's Boris Johnson that's undermining these democratic institutions that are very important to our country. These are institutions we've fought to create. Parliament is supposed to be the voice of the people. The idea that Parliament does not meet when you've got a national crisis and a national emergency is completely unacceptable. And yes, we have got to fight, not just against Brexit, we've got to fight against the undermining of our democracy.
Do you wish, back when, in some sort of way, shape or form, you'd been able to empower these institutions greater, back when you were Prime Minister or part of the Labour government as Chancellor of the Exchequer? Or do you feel as though all of us, we end up at times when things are going well a little bit too complacent about these battles that have had to be fought in the past?
Well, I wanted to do more. I wanted to take more children out of poverty. We took a lot of children out of poverty. I wanted to take more pensioners out of poverty. I wanted more people to have better jobs and more secure jobs. We wanted to do more for our health service and our public services. I mean, we were interrupted by the global financial crisis that started in America and affected all the financial institutions and then the livelihoods of people in Britain. And we had to fight to keep people in jobs. We had to fight to keep people in their homes and protect their mortgages. And that became so important in 2009-10. Yes, we wanted to do more, and we wanted reform of our constitution. I mean, I want the House of Lords to be representative of the regions and the nations and not some undemocratic institution. I want citizens' assemblies, as Hope Not Hate wants, round the country, so that you have an informed democracy, so that people can debate the issues as they did in Ireland before the abortion referendum. And so I want an extension of democracy. I think we've got to guard against people putting too much faith in social media when it becomes a battle between two extremes, like a shouting match without an umpire, and people retreat into the silos. We need something in our democracy that allows people to discuss these issues and then take an informed view of what should happen. And most members of the public would want to be part of the discussion, but we've got to create the mechanism by which that can happen.
Okay, thank you very much indeed to Gordon. This has been Neil Atkinson. I Hope Not Hate.